Hello and welcome to a very exciting co-production between World History Encyclopedia and the Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Today we're going to be chatting to Arienne King all about the history of abortion and family planning in the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean. Arienne is a history writer focused on the social history of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, and we are so looking forward to hearing from her today. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. This is a topic that I'm always excited to talk about. I'm very interested in. So,
brilliant. Well, I think we should just get right into it. How far back does the concept of abortion and family planning and contraceptives go?
It probably goes back to prehistory, but historians can definitively say that it goes back to at least the Bronze Age, because that's when we have the first written evidence of it as like a medical practice, of it as something that, people do.
Wow, brilliant. And so in regards to where in the world do we have that kind of evidence? Is it only in sort of one area, or do we see it worldwide?
For the purposes of this video, I'm mostly going to talk about the ancient Mediterranean and the Near East, because those are the regions that I'm most familiar with, and I feel like I could answer, with a good degree of confidence. To my knowledge, the oldest written reference to abortion comes from ancient Egypt around 1500 BC. And then after that point, you see evidence of it in a lot of neighboring civilizations, Babylon, Greece, Assyria, and so forth.
Wow, that's incredible. So we have ancient texts. What exactly do they refer to? Like, what do they mention? Do they mention the actual process of it, or do they just mention the concept of it?
The first reference to it is in a medical text. In the Ebers Papyrus, and it basically is instructions, presumably written by a physician for other physicians, on how to perform early-term abortions, And then the vast majority of our evidence for abortion comes from those medical texts when you're looking at Egypt. When you look at other civilizations, you see it pop up in, laws, in poetry about day-to-day life. This is especially true of Greece and Rome, because you have a good amount of poetry written during that period that talks about people's lives, their relationships, and things like that. But for the ancient Near East, especially in the Bronze Age, you don't have a lot, or you don't have as much of that type of evidence. So it's harder to look at it from that angle, from the personal day-to-day life angle.
Right. So we have both medical and also personal. So do we have any names of women that actually went through an abortion?
That's a little bit more difficult, and this kind of just speaks to a problem that you have with ancient sources in general. The majority of them are written by men for primarily male audiences. So women's perspectives, their personal lives and their experiences are kind of limited. Off the top of my head, I can't think of many women like that. There's one example from the work of a male Roman poet, Martial, about his lover who, had an abortion. But besides that, there's not much.
Right, that's so fascinating. So obviously abortion is something that in the ancient world only happened to women. However, we only have evidence that males were not only reading these texts, but writing these texts. Are there any sort of evidence with women actually engaging with any of this literature?
Again, not really, because there's just such of a huge bias in the type of evidence that we have that survives. So when we get it from physicians, the vast majority of our evidence of writing that was authored by physicians is male physicians, such as Hippocrates. And he mentions helping a courtesan, to receive an abortion. He doesn't mention her name. We don't really know anything about her as a person, what her life was like, who she was, or any of that, because to him and to his presumed audience, that wasn't important. And when you do have, in particularly Greek and Roman literature, when they do talk about women receiving abortions and the reason why, it's often with such a misogynistic slant. It's because, oh, they're vain, or they want to hide that they're having extramarital affairs or anything. And not a lot of the times the actual reasons why, the practical reasons why, the emotional reasons, we just miss out on that.
So there's no comments on whether it's for a medical reason, whether it's something that's actually affecting their health?
We do receive that also, again, primarily from physicians, when they wrote about abortion, because pregnancy in the ancient world was just so dangerous, it before a whole bunch of recent medical advancements, even today it's dangerous, but particularly in antiquity, there was just such a high rate of maternal mortality and complications that, a lot of the times abortion could be a matter of life or death. It could be life-saving.
Right, so we do have that, because I know today that's a main, a lot of the times women want to get abortions because it is going to save their life, so it's incredible that it's, that reason for it is, which it shouldn't be, but yes, controversial. Okay, what about, so when we've got these medical texts, do they mention any physical things that they use? Do we have any sort of evidence for actual medical instruments that would have been used?
So we have a lot of evidence about the two main types of abortion that women could have received in antiquity. The first was by consuming or in some way administering different plants and herbs or other chemicals that were known to have abortifacient qualities, that were known to induce miscarriages or to terminate pregnancies. And the interesting thing with this is that most of the times when women received an abortion in this way, the person who would actually be administering it, who would be in the physician's role or the doctor's role, would be another woman. Often these were administered by midwives or by women who had a lot of knowledge of and experience in dealing with medicinal plants. And that's part of why it's such a tragedy that our sources are, almost entirely written by men, because we miss out on a huge portion of that knowledge and of, that aspect of it. The second method would be surgical abortions. And these would often be administered by a male physician, by a surgeon. But they were less common because surgery, particularly any kind of gynecological surgery, was often considered to be very dangerous. They didn't have, any way to sterilize their tools as effectively as we do now, antibiotics, none of that. So it was often, in and of itself, a risky undertaking. And it can be hard to identify what ancient surgical tools were actually used for. A lot of the times they were probably multi-purpose because, you have one set of tools and you use them for whatever you can. So when it comes to identifying actual instruments and saying definitively this must have been used for abortion, it's hard. It was probably used for a variety of surgical procedures, abortion being just one of them.
For sure. So when it comes to the herbs and, the medicinal plants, number one, do we know what these herbs and plants are? And also, do we know, was this effective? Did it work?
A lot of them actually still exist today, some of them like pennyroyal and acacia. And there have actually been medical trials, clinical trials, to see if these plants or certain compounds from them are effective in inducing abortion. And a lot of the times they can be very effective. Some plants like silvium, which was used primarily in Greece and Rome and parts of the Near East, it no longer exists. It went extinct, so we can't speak to that. But for plants that we can study today, a lot of them would be. But this depends on how they were administered, the dosage, and so many other factors. So depending on, where you were in the ancient world, who you were going to obtain any kind of medical help from, the efficacy would vary greatly, depending on their knowledge, their expertise.
And did that sort of, I'm assuming depending on your status and how much wealth you had, would that then also affect the access to these kinds of things? Could anyone go and get an abortion, or was it sort of only for the upper echelons, people that could afford one could have one?
It's kind of hard to say, because the thing is, medical care in the ancient world was so variable. There were no medical schools. There was no like licensing or anything like that. So technically, we do know of very like wealthy people who maybe went to people who were physicians or who had a good reputation, and maybe by modern standards they didn't do such a good job. And at the same time, it's very possible that you could have been in a rural area, or you could have been less wealthy and still had access to a local physician or a local midwife or, anyone like that who, through their personal experience and their knowledge, might have been very good at what they did.
Right. So in general, if you were poor or whatever, you wouldn't then necessarily have access?
This is, again, something that's really hard to say, because access to physicians in the ancient world is so, like, patchy. It depended on where you lived. It depended on, what time period you lived in. We do know that some women who, might have been poorer, they might have been more rural, or they might have been of lower social status, that did still have access to abortions and were able to receive them.
So it's less so about their personal status and more so about where they are physically and what's available to them, like around them, and what they can actually access in the physical sense.
In the Roman Empire, a lot of male authors claimed, or they believed, that wealthy women were more likely to receive abortions. But this was a part of just broader stereotypes about wealthy women or women who had more social power, that they maybe were more promiscuous, or that they were able to do things that poor women didn't. And it's hard to say whether this is actually true, or whether this is just sort of misogynistic stereotypes, or a way of saying that abortions were frivolous, or that they, weren't necessarily always necessary, or slander against specific women, especially politically powerful women. So it's hard to say.
So it could also be used as like something against women.
Yes,
in these texts.
It could be, yeah.
Higher class women. Wow, okay. And so when we're talking about contraception, is that the same sort of thing where they would have access to that because they physically have access to it?
I would say so. There's a lot of overlap between abortion and contraception in the ancient world, because of the way that a lot of ancient cultures perceived the process of conception and the process of pregnancy. So you actually have a gray area between contraception and very early term abortion. So a lot of the same, medicines, a lot of the same procedures, a lot of the same plants that could be used to terminate an early pregnancy could be used to, induce menstruation. Or to prevent conception. And it's not necessarily clear that they made a distinction between these things. But often the person that you would go to purchase some type of contraception would be the same person who would be administering abortions.
So do we know, especially considering, as you've said, that a lot of the literature that we have around contraception and abortion was written by men, do we have anything regarding the views of abortion? So we know that in Rome they used it potentially to go, to slander elite women, but do we have sort of the social views of abortion, whether people thought that it was something that, wasn't appropriate, or whether they thought that it was something that was necessary and like a basic human right?
For the most part, for the societies that we do have evidence for, people's views on abortions, their personal views on it, it seems that it was mostly accepted to a great extent. You do have the examples that I mentioned of people using it as slander in the Roman Empire. But at the same time, it was something that many women would have received at some point. It was something that was understood to be a medical procedure, that it could be life-saving, that it could preserve the health of women, and that just for social or economic reasons, it could be very important. This is true not just in Greece and Rome, but also in, for example, Jewish communities in the ancient Near East and the ancient Mediterranean. You have a lot of actual religious literature from that period that talks about abortion. It talks about contraception, and it even outlines, situations in which, to protect the health of the mother or her well-being, you should, or you are morally almost obligated to perform an abortion, where it can be life-saving or where it can benefit the mother in important ways.
So in these areas, so we're talking, the Near East, Mediterranean, was there any sort of, so since we have so much medical text, was there any sort of advancement or development in these concepts of abortion and contraception, or did it say they had something that it worked and they didn't really try new things?
There was definitely some advancement because when you look at just medicine, reproductive healthcare, and healthcare in general in the ancient Near East, in Egypt and, for example, Babylon and Assyria during that Bronze Age period, you do have, obviously you have some effective treatments, but you also have a kind of medical theory that is based heavily on spiritual factors, on supernatural factors. So magic and medicine are very much interwoven. And you have a lot of, treatments that, from a modern point of view, aren't that effective. Magical amulets, magical spells that probably did not do much, but were used in conjunction with, plants and surgical procedures that would have been more useful. But if you look at during the Greek and Roman periods, of course, supernatural and religious methods were still used by some physicians, by some midwives. You have a growing focus on empirical evidence and on physical causes of both ailments and of things like, pregnancy. So obviously the treatments that were used became a bit more effective, a bit more rooted in the scientific method. But it's not a clear line of progression, but you do, I think, have some development.
Okay, because they shifted their sort of focus from the supernatural to the physical. So when it comes to the religion of these cultures, there wasn't any sort of, pushback? There was nothing in the religion that said that there was, that went against the idea of abortion and contraception?
For the most part, no. To my knowledge, most polytheistic religions, with multiple gods, like the Greek pantheon or Egyptian religion, there wasn't any particular religious objection to abortion at all, because for one thing, the concept of ensoulment or a life beginning at conception did not exist. They felt in much the way that modern scientists and modern doctors feel that, gestation is a gradual process. From the moment of conception, it's not necessarily a person, and it may never be. And this is something that is pretty common throughout the Near East and the ancient Mediterranean. There's only one exception that I can think of, and that is in the Zoroastrian religion of Persia, which was always, even within the Persian Empire, it wasn't necessarily the prevailing religion. You had within the empire a lot of other religions and beliefs and traditions that continued on in, tandem with Zoroastrianism. And looking at monotheistic religions in the ancient Near East, for example, Judaism, again, there's no objection to abortion at that point.
So we don't get any sort of dichotomy, any sort of clash of ideas and views until we move into when? So the modern period, literally the last few hundred years, or was it sort of, if medieval? When does this idea that it's a bad thing, when did that start?
It can be clearly traced to the 2nd or 3rd century AD, because this is when Christianity began to develop. It began to develop as the primary religion in the Roman Empire. And it wasn't a foregone conclusion that early Christians would decide that abortion was necessarily a sin or that contraception was a sin. This was something that early Christians debated because in the Bible, in the Old Testament or the New Testament, and in the different religious texts that they had at the time, it's not clearly prohibited at all. So it was something that a lot of early Christian theologians and a lot of who we now refer to as church fathers, the people who, helped to found the doctrine that modern Christian denominations often draw on. It wasn't a foregone conclusion to them. They debated it. They weren't sure. And it was in this environment of controversy and of back and forth and of religious debate on the morality of it that you started to have the first staunch anti-abortion advocates come forth. The first one that I can think of, the earliest one that's usually seen as like the progenitor of this, is Tertullian. He was a Roman Christian living in the empire, and he took the stance that contraception was a sin because humans, Christians, had a responsibility to multiply, to reproduce, and that, any kind of sex that wasn't for reproductive purposes was inherently sinful, even within marriage. And he also took the stance that life began at conception. And this was not something that every other Christian believed. It was not something that every other Christian, even in the centuries after him, in late antiquity, in the Middle Ages, agreed with. Because you have prominent theologians like Augustine of Hippo who are like, actually, abortion can be a good thing. It can be necessary. It's not necessarily a sin. And this is in like the 5th century. This is in like towards the early Middle Ages. But Tertullian was the first to take the hardline anti-abortion stance. And then after that point, often within the church, you do have a lot of religious objections to abortion.
And I guess that is why there's so many hotly debated, it's such a hotly debated topic now, and that stems from a concept from 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is it was a controversy then. It was a controversy during the Middle Ages. It was never something that you could point to like a Christian doctrine or like Christians as a whole and say every Christian theologian, every bishop, every priest or whatever thinks that this is a sin. It was always something that was debated. And I think that's part of why even today it continues to be something that's debated, because although you have, hardliners who are like, well, this interpretation obviously is the correct one. Anything else is wrong. It's not something that's explicitly stated in the religious text. So it's something that's always open to interpretation. The objection to abortion is something that's almost a matter of tradition. It's almost assumed because it's something that so many prominent leaders in the church have advocated for and have stated as truth for so long.
It's fascinating that it would just be accepted by numerous different cultures with different religions and different beliefs. And then suddenly this one guy is like, hold on. And then that causes 2,000 years of debate.
Yeah, and sometimes that's just the way that societal or cultural changes can happen, because the spread of Christianity and then the use of, even today, even in secular cultures in many parts of Europe and even the Middle East and Africa, Christianity is almost built into the ethical and the legal framework of these countries because it was the prevailing religion for so long. But to understand part of where the, I guess, shift or the sea change in viewing abortion as something that's negative as opposed to being more accepting of it comes from is broader changes in how people thought of women and of women's bodies and their autonomy over their bodies that happened at the same time that Christianity was beginning to spread and was beginning to become a more cohesive church, like as an entity that was in some ways almost like a nation state in itself. So at the same time, you have a lot of the same individuals like Tertullian who are advocating for women to basically be more controlled in their personal lives. So while technically early Christians didn't want anyone to have, premarital sex or to have these relationships, it was especially stated that women should not. Like, it's especially unforgivable when it's a woman, and that a woman's place is specifically to have children, to nurture children, and all of that, whereas with men, they had a bit more leeway. So it makes sense then that abortion and contraception would be first on the chopping block of things that you're thinking, well, you know what, actually, this is not something that you should have access to. This is something that we should look at banning.
Because I guess historically, women, especially I'm thinking of Greece and Rome, they're sort of there is that, especially for women that are married. So, there's the idea that they should, their place in the society is the domestic setting. So there is that sort of control over maybe their movements, but I don't recall ever sort of reading about men having control over their bodies. You have that idea that the men work outside and then they're the ones that are vocal in politics and society, but then women have their own domain in the home. And although today we're like, oh, no, thank you, I would like to go out and be a part of politics and et cetera, you don't feel that there's that, like, that control over them as a person.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is especially true of ancient Greece. Men and women almost lived in separate spheres because, like you said, women occupied very much that private sphere of life, in the home, whereas men very much were present and active in the public sphere, in politics, in business and things like that. So you do, to an extent, have women who live very vibrant, very, complex lives in that sphere. And another thing is, like you mentioned, women's bodily autonomy. Women did lack rights in ancient Greece and Rome. They had a higher degree of bodily autonomy in some ways, because when it came to their bodies, their pregnant bodies, their control over their own health, they basically, as far as we know, had final say. This was not something that, for the most part, men could intrude on. In some cases, this was limited to an extent. For example, in some cases, in some parts of Greece during specific time periods, women did have to obtain the permission of their husband if they wanted an abortion. But this seems to be almost possibly the exception rather than the rule. And it's still an improvement from later periods when the shift turned to women not being able to use contraception or to obtain an abortion at all.
Yeah, when they essentially became property of their male guard. And I guess we sort of have that idea in the ancient world as well, but less so bodily autonomy wise. And I guess when it comes to especially ancient Egypt, women could be physicians, women could be scribes, learn to read, and then become medical practitioners. And so we can only assume then that sort of bodily autonomy extends to that region. And I can only assume it'd be this kind of same thing in Mesopotamia as well, and in the ancient Near East, where they had the ability, I think, to be medical practitioners.
Physicians, yeah, to some extent. It definitely, I would say, Egypt is an obvious candidate for a society where women had a lot of rights. They could, own and operate businesses. They could own property. They were, like you said, they could be educated as physicians or scribes. And then even when you look at other societies in the Near East, in Mesopotamia, they're a little bit less egalitarian. There's a little bit less gender equality, but there's still a good amount of freedom for women in those societies. And again, you do have, in going off of information in, Mesopotamian literature and evidence, and in evidence from civilizations like Persia, we do know that women worked in this, medical field to some extent, that most, midwives were women, that women often went to other women when they wanted to obtain some kind of medical treatment. So that was their first option. And that makes it kind of abortion and contraception and just women's reproductive health in general was kind of a woman's sphere. It was something that was, primarily between women.
Well, I think we've pretty much covered the whole of abortion and contraception in the ancient Near East and in the Mediterranean. So thank you so much for joining me. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you today.
Absolutely. It was wonderful talking to you about this as well.